Hey there, Social Studies 20 here. Going to take a look today at a couple of topics. The first one, internationalism and environmentalism. Just want to talk quickly about Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, what we're studying, and we've looked at this from a variety of angles. We've studied internationalism and poverty, internationalism and debt, and so on. And one more topic we look at is what role does internationalism play in terms of protecting the environment, internationalism. And probably the best tool to measure environmentalism would be to go after greenhouse gas emissions, global warming. I mean, after all, there are a lot of issues facing the global environment, the pollution of oceans and so on, but probably the number one concern, and I'm sure you'd agree, would be global warming, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So it's not a lesson on how that happens. You know by now what the greenhouse effect is and so on. You know the causes, you know the effects. But what you may not know is how we have tried and probably failed so far to guard against global warming and greenhouse gas emissions. So I wanted to spend maybe 10 minutes talking about the measures taken and maybe where we need to go from here. I'm not sure if you ever heard of the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol, um, it's from 1997, so before you were even born, so you may not remember, and I would forgive you for that. But Kyoto Protocol was born out of 1997, and delegates from almost 200 nations met in the city of Kyoto, Japan, to talk and agree upon a method to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The plan was that all countries would sign the agreement, and in signing the agreement, you were basically agreeing as a country to reduce your greenhouse gas emission levels by 5% below the 1990 level. And you're going to do this by 2012. So they signed this in 1997. And the agreement was that you're going to work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You're going to lower them by 5% below what you were emitting as a country in 1990. And you're going to do this by 2012. Kyoto Protocol. It actually expired quite some time ago now in 2012, so it's gone. Um, and at that time, it was significant because it was really the only international agreement we had that concerned itself with climate change. It was the first time ever, and the only one we had at that point that dealt with countries working together from an international perspective to deal with climate change. I mean, it's really only going to work if all countries agree to do it and actually abide by it. Um, if one or two rogue countries decide they're not going to follow climate change agreements, well, then it's just not going to work. Protocol, it was good for its time, but over the long haul, it failed. It failed because number one, not all countries had to agree to the protocol. So, for example, developing countries like China, like India, like Brazil and South Africa, they were not forced to abide by Kyoto. They didn't have to go along with it. The reason being because they were still developing. So from their perspective, from China's perspective, from India's perspective, they would say, listen, who are you to tell us to combat climate change when you're the sole reason that we need to combat climate change? In other words, China would say to America, who are you to boss us around? You had your decades of industrial growth at the expense of the environment. You had your decades where you emitted greenhouse gases like there was no tomorrow, so you could develop as a country. Who are you to tell us now that we shouldn't be doing that? And so China, India, Brazil, and South Africa were left out. They didn't have to abide by Kyoto Protocol. And the US itself refused to ratify the treaty. So they didn't go along with it either. Their reason being, well, if you're not going to make China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, then we're not going along with it either. Um, Canada itself never really implemented Kyoto Protocol either. We didn't meet the goal either. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, number one, the Canadian climate is not one, I mean, we need to burn fossil fuels. Like we have to. We need to heat our houses in the winter. Our economy is very dependent on the extraction of oil, you know that. And for us just to shut down the oil industry, for us just to stop burning oil is just not feasible. Economically, we would be facing a recession, if not an economic depression. As I'm giving this lesson right now in the middle of June, Alberta is facing what you could call a depression by this fall. If Jason Kenney is right in his predictions for the Albertan economy, and this is because oil has plummeted in value. So right now, as it stands, we're actually losing money from Alberta when we export oil. Like we're actually not making any money off of the deal. We're giving money away really. Um, and so because the barrel has plummeted so much in value, Kenny's saying that by the fall there will be dire economic consequences. And so it's nice to talk about Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, but it might not translate into reality for all countries is what I'm trying to say. In the end, most countries that signed Kyoto failed to put it into action. In other words, it's one thing to sign a treaty saying that you're going to do this and you're going to do this and this, but it's another thing to actually go about doing it. So internationalism really only works if nations agree to do something like fight climate change and you actually do it. You can't just talk about it, you actually have to implement it. And what it would mean for Canada, it would really hurt our economy. We'd have to find alternative energy sources. And so that's why we didn't really go through with Kyoto. And so you could say that Canada failed in implementing Kyoto because, we had to put what was best for Canada first over the international community. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. We have to look after Canadians and the Canadian economy. But if you get a series of countries that start doing that, Canada, the US, and so on, well, then I guess it's just not going to work. Before we keep going, I thought I'd show you this. So here, per capita CO2 emissions on Earth right now. So per capita means per person, per population. So per capita is how much CO2, greenhouse gas, you are emitting as a country divided by your country's population. Okay, so per capita is a different way at looking at things. And you can see that per capita, Canada is actually a rogue state. We're the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, CO2, per capita. But don't forget, it's per capita. And so what you need to understand before you freak out is that Canada does not have a big population. Canada's actually got a rather small population globally. So while we look really guilty on this graph, we're not as guilty as you might be thinking because we've got a smaller population than some other countries. Okay? Here's another way of looking at it that maybe you won't feel as bad being a Canadian. Here's just, the gross total emission of CO2 gases. And you can see that China is 28%, the biggest, America's 16%. And this is just in total emissions. Canada really isn't as bad. We're only 2%. So Canada is a minor player on the global stage in terms of CO2 emissions. Per capita, we're big, but you don't always measure things per capita. What good does it do really? You need to factor in population and so on. And so on the global stage, countries that are of concern, of course, China, of course, America, India is only 6%, but they're on the rise economically. Russia 5%, there's a bunch at 2, a bunch at 1, and the rest of the world would be 21%. So to combat climate change, you would need to get the big players to go along with it. If the big ones don't agree to abide by it, other countries will bow out of it. They'll leave it as well, and then it's just not going to work. And I can understand, if America refuses to go along with combating climate change, what motive does Canada have to go along with it? What motive does Mexico have to go along with it? You need all parties on board for it to work. Here's the new Kyoto. It's called the Paris Agreement. It's from, well, it went into effect in 2016. And so the goal of the Paris Agreement is it's the same end product, but they're going to go about it differently. So the central aim is to prevent the rise in global temperatures. Okay, so we want to keep it this century well below 2 degrees and make an effort to limit it to just 1.5. So what we're trying to do is decrease the temperature increase on a global scale over the next few years. And the only way you're going to do that is if countries agree to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's how you're going to lower the global mean temperature. Again, it's one thing to sign this and say that you're going to abide by it, which Canada has among a lot of other countries, but to actually put it in effect is a different story, because it's going to hurt your economy. It could cause a recession or a depression. You still need an alternative energy source. I mean, we need another way of producing energy beyond fossil fuels. And until that's there, we're going to have to burn fossil fuels. And just as a caveat, in 2019, Donald Trump pulled America out of the Paris Agreement. And so when one country leaves, usually other countries will now follow suit because as we looked about in the previous chart, America is a big emitter of greenhouse gases. And if they're not going to go along with it, well, then what motivation do the other guys have? And so if they pull out, we're going to be back to square one again. So I guess what we're saying here is that internationalism really only works is if your country is willing to give up sovereignty, to maybe give up and sacrifice what is best for your country in favor of what is best for the rest of the planet. And that might be dreaming. I don't know. So far, we haven't done a very good job of it. And that's why climate change continues. So there's another little tidbit for you to consider when you think about the role of internationalism in terms of a nation's foreign policy. How much sovereignty should you give up to serve the greater good of the world, I guess. All right, thanks.